Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for being here with us today. My name is Tessa Caleb, and I'm the marketing lead for Machine Africa Network of Industries, which is a company under Gearbox. So today we'll have an open discussion on scaling hardware innovation in Africa. So it's going to be a day full of fun and learning. Just to give you context before we get started, the Africa Open Hardware Community is a movement that started in 2019 by a group of hardware enthusiasts with the goal of sharing ideas about electronics hardware development capability. From these humble beginnings, the community has since grown to 100 members plus who meet regularly, not only to share ideas, but to support each other in the innovation journey. Its membership ranges from aspiring engineers and makers to the industries, established innovators with commercially available products in the market. The community strives to create an accommodating environment for both beginners and experts in the field to help grow the local ecosystem through sharing and collaboration using open source tools and resources. Over to you, let's see.
Thank you, Tessa. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Gearbox, the Gearbox ecosystem. As Tessa mentioned, my name is Latif Chirono. I'm actually a mechanical engineer by training. Most of my experience is in manufacturing. And when you break down that further, it's a little bit in automotive manufacturing, but most of it in electronics manufacturing. And when I moved back home, I went to university in the United States, worked in the United States for close to 12 years. And then when I moved back home to do consulting in manufacturing process improvement, I didn't think that I would get back into electronics manufacturing. However, scrolling down Twitter one day in 2015, I believe, I saw a tweet from Gearbox, and Gearbox had a little pick and place machine for prototyping, and I was excited. I said, I know this is my stuff. So I reached out to Dr. Kamal, and we started a conversation of how do we bring world-class manufacturing in electronics to Kenya. 5 years later, or 6 years later, we have now a full world-class SMT manufacturing line that can produce between 600,000 to 700,000 devices, and we're looking to grow that over the next 5 years. So a little bit of context about Gearbox Europlacer. It's a joint venture between Gearbox and two UK companies, one of those being Europlacer, which is one of the world's leading manufacturers of the equipment that makes electronics, right? So Europlacer is actually a leader in this field, and they focus on flexible manufacturing equipment. Now let's talk about innovation and the community that we're trying to build. The challenge of hardware, other than it's hard, right, is you need access to not only technology, but you need access to equipment, right? So if you're, maybe you can, you're starting on that journey of building a PCB in your bedroom or, you know, in the lab after school, and you don't have access to a pick and place machine, or you don't have access to equipment that can help you fabricate a board. Understanding that process becomes a little bit difficult, right? So, and also having fellow peers who have been through that journey can help you reduce that time in product development. So this community that we're building, this Africa Open Hardware community, is that, just that. We want to catalyze and get everybody who's involved in hardware together in one space, share ideas, collaborate, and understand what's the quickest path to success.
The important thing that we're really looking to try to promote in Kenya as Gearbox and this community is to see whether we can manufacture successfully and competitively more of what we consume in Kenya, in East Africa, in Africa in general. And that really is a basis for industrialization, for quality jobs, for quality of life to rise and so on. And we're looking to see how deliberately, intentionally, from a point of view of innovation, which is you, this community, but also policy and so on, we can influence what happens, like happens in many other countries, so that we have this thing happen successfully. If you walk around or drive around industrial area, the number of big formal industries that are owned by Africans is very, very small. The Indian Kenyans are Kenyans, so that's great, and we support that. But we're wondering why 60 years on from independence, the representation from Africans in industrialization is as small as it is. And so we're trying to deliberately address that and widen the base. It's not a substitution thing, it's widening the base. So even when you have international companies coming in, like what we've got with Europlacer, we want it to be based on a joint venture that is meaningful so that there's true tech transfer. We're very proud to have been the place at which people are developing machines that are designed for automation, like CNC machines, computer numerical control. So after this, you might, if you haven't been here before, go downstairs and you'll see some machines that have been built by engineers here, which are at the, I would say, entry level for automation, for industrial automation. And for me, what I've seen in my own career is that solutions to the problems that we've got come in warm, soft bodies, human beings. And so that's all of you. That solution, like to what we needed to set up Gearbox, a lot of that solution was in Latif because of the experience he's had in the US doing the same thing. So when he came, we hit the ground running in a way that we would never have been able to if we had to bring in people from outside who are very expensive, expatriates, this, that, and the other. And also, you're not really sure whether when that kind of partnership happens, you're going to have the knowledge actually transferring into the country. So this is a real pleasure to have Charly Mwangi. I'm very proud of him and what he's managed to do. He'll explain to us what his story was. And what I love about his story in particular is that he's just us, me and you. So many of you will see yourself in his story. But what is exceptional is how he's managed to leverage what he got right here. He's fully Kenyan. And to be able to develop in the way that he has over there. So he'll share with us some of how that journey has happened. And so that takes me straight into my first question, or I guess invitation to you, Charly, as we welcome you and you'll say hello to everybody and tell them a bit about who you are. What was your journey?
Thanks for having me. I really I enjoy when I come to Gearbox. I've known Gearbox for 6 years now, Doc, right? So Doc and I started interacting through an introduction, and then we actually found out that we are family friends, but we just didn't know each other. As you've heard, my name is Charly Mwangi. Actually, Charly is a nickname, Charles Mwangi, but mostly known by Charly. Born and raised here. So I went to, starting from way back when, I went to school here, did my university here. I went to Strathmore School, and it's important I point that out because I think it was one of the most influential periods in my life, very formative in terms of how I think, how I approach learning, really has a lot to do with Strathmore, and we can deep dive that if you guys are interested. It was really good to see there's a lot of people who haven't attended the talk I've given. It's really good to give a talk at Gearbox because I've been giving talks at many places that are purely software. I'm not a software engineer. So there's bits, atoms, I'm in the atom space, and it's good to come to Gearbox because you guys, we speak the same language, so it's really a pleasure to be here. I was passionate about two things, buildings and cars. Way back when, I didn't think that there was much I could do with cars. In Kenya, there was no example of someone who had a career in automotive, right? But there were many examples of people who had successful careers in the construction space. So I decided to do civil engineering. So I joined Jomo Kenyatta University in 1999, focused on civil engineering. And I was doing that, I did that for 3.5 years, 3 years actually. And a friend of mine and my sister who were in the US convinced me to go to the US. So moved to the US, got a scholarship at a general engineering scholarship at a school called Tennessee State University. And it's interesting, on the first day of university, the heads of departments were giving introduction to just all the new engineering students. And they were talking about what various departments were going to work on. And the head of department for mechanical engineering said that something very interesting. So just to give some context, way back when, I think it's late 80s or early 90s, General Motors built some electric vehicles. It's called the EV1. and sold a bunch of them, and then they bought them back from the customers and destroyed them. Did you know that? No, you didn't know that? Okay, you should check it out. So they kept a handful of them, and donated them to various schools. It so happens that one of them was donated to my school, Tennessee State. So the head of department, as I was giving introduction, the head of department for mechanical engineering said one of the things that the department was going to work on was reviving that electric vehicle. And so there and then I decided to switch to mechanical engineering. So I walked up to him and I showed him a booklet I had with all the transcripts from university here at JKUAT. And we take a bunch of classes here, right? So like you should be rest assured if you can survive in any university here, for sure you can thrive abroad. So I showed him the transcripts and he looked at them, and even though I was a civil engineering major, I'd taken classes across the board. So he said you can switch to mechanical without losing a heartbeat. So I switched right there to mechanical, and I was still a senior. The sad part is we never got to work on the EV one, right? The good news is I switched to mechanical. But then, so I did 4 semesters, and then I had 1 semester left to graduate, but I didn't want to graduate because as a foreigner, you need visa to get employment. And so, Doc is smiling because he's had this story before. So visa issues were, like I have a PhD in visa issue resolution, right? They plagued my entire career. But they actually turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to me. So I highly recommend visa problems in your career. So anyway, so I really wanted to get experience before I graduate, because then a company can justify in the US why they are sponsoring this foreigner. So I applied for a bunch of internships. I used to say for every single internship an American applied for, I applied for at least 10 to 20, so about 20x. So I was fortunate to get just picked by Toyota, and I think it's because it was last minute, someone dropped out and my resume was on top, and they're like, oh, we want this guy. And the funny thing is, I was actually disappointed that I got into Toyota, right? Not disappointed because I would have preferred other car companies, because in my mind, I associated Toyota with the Corollas I saw in Kenya. So it's like they don't make the best cars. But I wanted to get into GM or Daimler because of the image I had of the cars that they make. Only to find out once I joined Toyota that it was one of the best automotive companies, right? At that point especially. So in 2003, December, missed my sister's graduation to start at Toyota. So she still reminds me of that. So I started at Toyota as an intern. It was fantastic. But then remember, at that particular time, we talk about visa issues, Toyota had adopted a global policy where they would not sponsor foreigners in the country they were domiciled in. So if they're in the US, they would not sponsor foreigners outside. But as long as I was a student, my school could sponsor me to do an internship. And so when I figured I could never work at Toyota, and I figured it was a good opportunity for me to learn, I decided to do 5 semesters back to back. So I went to Toyota, did an internship, and then I told my manager, I want to be here for 5 semesters back to back. So they actually treated me like an engineer, even though I was there as an intern. And it was fantastic. But then I had a deadline, because I knew I could never work at Toyota after I graduated. So it was really that deadline, that official deadline, allowed me to really focus a lot at Toyota. And so fast forward, 2 years later, I go back to school, that 1 semester left, and I graduate, right? Now I have 2 years of experience. And at that point, I hadn't found an automotive. I was sure I was passionate about cars, as always, but I hadn't found an automotive company that was willing to sponsor me. So I'd interviewed with a bunch of them, but they told me, unfortunately, we don't sponsor. And so the only job offer I had was from a company called Cessna. So Cessna, they make the private jets. And I'd been to their factory for the interview, and I found it painfully boring. Apologies to people who are passionate about jets or things like that, but I found it painfully boring. So it was going to be a last resort, just a job to hold. And a week before I graduated, a friend of mine who worked at Nissan, and Nissan was in the same city as my university, he approached me and told me, there's a gentleman at Nissan who knows of a Charles Mwangi. Charles Mwangi are many here, but they're not that many in the US. So these guys, like, they were talking, that guy had been poached from Toyota to Nissan. He was a director at Nissan, and he had been one of my informal mentors. And so this guy asked me to send him my resume. I sent him my resume. Within 60 seconds, he called me back from when I hit send. And those are days of desktop, right? So I'm sending on a desktop. And he called me back and he asked me, hey, Charlie, have you interviewed with, I'm sure you have an offer from Toyota, but please interview with Nissan before you accept Toyota. I couldn't work at Toyota. He had no idea. So anyway,
But you didn't say that.
I didn't say that. Yeah, I said, yeah, I think I can squeeze you guys in my schedule. So, so I ended up interviewing with Nissan within a week. And at the interview, before we started, I just told the recruiter, by the way, I need sponsorship. I need visa if I'm to be employed here. I don't want you to waste my time. I don't want to waste your time. And they told me it wouldn't be a problem. So at that point, I'd already interviewed, and they're like, no, it won't be a problem. We're happy to sponsor you. So yeah, that was 2005, towards the end of the year, just a week before I graduated. So in 2012, this company called me and asked me whether I was interested in interviewing. It was a small, unknown company that was doing electric vehicles.
They called you?
Yeah, they called me. And I accepted to do the interview. That company was Tesla. This is in 2012, around August. Very few people knew about Tesla. I knew about them, but I didn't think much about them. But once I interviewed with them, I thought it was fantastic. I got beat by the red bug, as we used to say. Tesla car theme in everything they do is red, so that's why you say got beat by the red bug. So yeah, after interviewing, interesting thing is the last person I talked to, VP, told me there's a high probability that the company may be bankrupt in 6 months. But I still took the job. And my logic was, one, I'm leaving Mississippi, I'm going to California, so there's a bonus there. And then the second thing is I thought, if the company fails, I'd go do an MBA at Stanford or something like that. Not saying that Stanford would accept me, I don't know, but that was my backup plan. So yeah, in October 2012, I started at Tesla. I started off as an engineer. And I think there is, especially with the Kenyan audience, I'd like to talk about that. About that interview, because I think there are lessons to draw from that, which is something we struggle with as Kenyans, which is, confidence, right? But the two of the people who interviewed me had as much experience as had been alive at that point. So I told the recruiter, there's no way I'm coming in as a lead engineer to lead these guys who've had 28 years of experience. And then I was about 28, and I was like, there's no way. So I came in as an engineer, and my first 6 months were miserable. And they were miserable because I realized that I'd undersold myself, right? As soon as we started interacting and working with the guys, I realized I could have done a lead engineer role. And the first 6 months were miserable. And I remember at the end of the 6 months, my wife just told me, either you leave or you suck it up and just execute. And that's what I did. So I sucked it up. But I think there's an important lesson there in terms of underselling yourself and being more confident in terms of your capabilities. So anyway, I joined as an engineer. I was there for 6.5 years. I had 7 different roles. So only the first 2 years did I have the same role. So after that, every year I'd have different roles. To give people some context, my role was, I started in manufacturing engineering. At Toyota, I was manufacturing engineering. At Nissan, I was in manufacturing engineering. I joined Tesla as a manufacturing engineer. And then as my career grew, it was in 2016 when I finally took over a director of engineering role. And I had responsibilities now outside of manufacturing engineering, but also on product design of the body of the car, which is one of the most complex and largest subsystems on the vehicle. And then thereafter, I took on a senior director role, but then I was responsible for a bunch of different departments in manufacturing engineering, but also some product design role. Any questions? Yeah.
Yeah, super impressive. So tell us more then. You were at Tesla for how long?
6.5 years.
6.5 years.
Yeah.
And while you were there, I'm sure everybody would like to know, how much did you interact with Elon Musk?
So when I, at the end of my, before I became, actually, end of 2017 and 2018, I reported to Elon. So it was.
So what can you talk about what that was like? Is it because we all hear about he's extremely driven. He sleeps very few hours, which means probably everybody around him has to sleep few hours. Or you're probably used to that anyway. But maybe tell us a little bit about that experience.
Yeah, I mean, even prior to that, so as soon as we started working at Tesla on the Model X, at that point I was a manager responsible for what's called process engineering, so designing the process of building the body of the car. And we're building the Model X. If you guys have seen, it has the Falcon doors. And so the most difficult thing was just getting the Falcon doors to be geometrically accurate so that you can achieve what they call fit and finish, right? And so because I was responsible for that, we had very interesting interactions with Elon very early in my career. So that's around 2014, 2015. I think he's the hardest working human being I've ever come across. Like just, I don't even know whether to call it work ethic, just amazing focus, works really, really extremely hard. When I left Tesla, I worked with a guy who started Uber. His name is Travis Kalanick. Also very, very impressive from an intellectual perspective. Then went to Rivian, worked obviously with RJ Scaringe, who's the founder. So I got to understand and just pick some patterns there. And the thing that I was explaining to people is we all live in 3 dimensions, at least adults, right? And I got to see people who live in like 7 dimensions, right? And like Elon is one of those guys who lives in 7 dimensions. And what I mean by that is that, you're seated here, you're looking at this table and you appreciate it, but then someone will be curious, what is this material? Why did you make the design choices you have? Why did you choose this material? Could the shape have been different? What is the process you use? They're just super curious. And that's how they live everywhere.
Great, thank you. It's really interesting to hear your journey, especially in automotive manufacturing, and I kind of parallel to my journey in automotive manufacturing. Mine was more dirty, on CNC machines and coolants and whatnot. But what I'd really like to hear from you is your work at Tesla. You created
I'm sorry to interrupt.
No,
it's funny how Kenyans just forget everything other than Tesla.
No, no, understood.
Everyone, tell us about Tesla. I left Tesla 3 years ago. There's Rivian. How about you talk about Rivian?
Right. We'll come back to it. We'll come back to that.
It's fine. Yeah.
So really, what I'm trying to get from you is your journey in creating a successful product, right? What was that process? And you were creating a lot of new tools, new designs, and really, how did you manage innovation and product towards success? So maybe if you can just talk a little bit, how do you manage that?
I think I can talk about some of the key differentiators. I think the process is probably well understood, but some of the key differentiators, I think the biggest thing I saw that was different, and it's something I've stuck to, is that at Tesla there was no a team set aside that did R&D. R&D was not even a thing, right? Historically R&D has been, this bunch of people with PhDs whose output is a piece of paper, right? Here's a paper of what we should do. And that was very much integrated. What you do in the future was very much integrated in the responsibility of the teams who are executing today. Because, the dilemma you always face is the people who you kind of put aside to do R&D were not steeped in reality, right? And then the people who were doing the day-to-day, they felt like the expectation was not to think about tomorrow. But when you combine the two, I think you achieve amazing results. So in every engineering group that I led, we were responsible for executing for today, but also thinking about tomorrow, which was very interesting. And so what I've found to work, and I think this is, through various iterations, is to make sure that, again, if you think about, you want to force people to think, because a company, a team is a collection of people, right? Delivering a product or a service. And so what you're going to get is just a function of how the people approach a problem, how they think, how aligned they are. And so what I've actually found to work is just making sure that you have, you're very clear and ambitious objectives. Some of them may not even be achievable in the short term or even in the long run, but they become your North Star. And so identifying a North Star is important.
I'd like to ask this question to you, Dr. Kamau, in regards to the fact that we are calling for the fact that we want a lot more engineers coming out so that we can start pushing local manufacturing, but at the same time, with your experience at university, we have them coming out, but then the jobs are not there. So how do we create this balance, and how do you see this playing out to the advantage for the engineers who are actually putting themselves out there?
Yeah, thanks. That's a very important question to us and something that we think a lot about. That basically, if you benchmark what happens in this part of the world, in Africa in general, in terms of the number of graduates in engineering with parts of the world like Malaysia, Vietnam, the ones that are coming up right now, and of course the South Koreans and so on, per capita we have too few engineers graduating or enrolled in the places for engineering. Engineering in universities too small. But at the same time, the industry is not big enough to absorb many of the ones who are graduating. So you have a lot of unemployment, at least for a while, for many engineers coming out of university. And one of the things that we think is really important is, first of all, to build the ecosystem so that people are able to apply their engineering more easily. And that, a lot of what Charlie has just talked about is the kind of thing we'd like to see happen. And because he's talking about it from a part of the world where there's a lot of resource to be able to be put into that's one challenge. Of course, innovation and innovativeness allows you to bypass, to short circuit that constraint. But the thing that I personally feel we need to really focus on is government availing the opportunity and building the ecosystem deliberately with the taxpayer money that they are custodians over. So a good example is something that if you look downstairs, you'll see. If the government has to buy things, the procurement that they undertake on our behalf with our money, taxpayer money, they should be working very hard to make sure that they can make as many of those things that they need for us from us. So if it's hospital beds, you'll see downstairs there's a large budget in the public health system in Kenya to buy hospital beds, and they're mostly coming from outside of the country. It's not a very complex product. So what they're doing, what we are doing, or what the government decision makers are doing with the money that we are giving them control over, is to create jobs abroad, the kinds of jobs that we really need here. So if, like what did happen, to give credit where it's due, the government decided under a lot of pressure from the Kenya Association of Manufacturing that if you're going to assemble motorbikes and do it, from kits that are coming from outside, those kits, there are certain items in the kit that should never be part of the kit coming in. In other words, whoever's doing the assembly must source those parts locally. And the reactions, like some of the large motorbike makers from like Japan, one in particular that I know, they said, well, your local suppliers don't have the standards that we require. There's certain ISO standards, this, that, and the other, in order to be able to take that part and put it into our motorbike, which is branded. And so the response from the government was, well, you deal with those guys who you say are substandard and make sure that they raise their standards to the standard that you're saying. Use your own investment to do that. Now, that's a very good proposal. The trouble then arises when what we call the race to the bottom kicks in, meaning that that company, which is large, which has a budget that's the size of a mid-sized country, can simply say, okay, if Kenya is giving us this headache and saying that we have to source and actually upgrade their suppliers, let's go to Tanzania. And because Tanzanians are saying, oh, come. And we won't make you do that. Or it could be Kenyans, I'm just giving that as an example. Or we'll give you a 10-year tax holiday. Or they're giving you 10 years, we'll give you 20 years. You know, that race to the bottom doesn't serve us at all in the long run. And so that's what kind of militates against that kind of action that I'm talking about. But I think it's very possible to put into place a lot of policies that help us to build up industry on the basis of government procurement, which then spills over into private sector.
I'm working on a program for STEM. The three of you, Dr. Kamau, Charlie, and Latif, you've emphasized on something, and that is education. And the level of education that you've probably emphasized on was from campus to where you are at the moment. What I'm looking forward to bringing as a platform here in Kenya is a STEM platform where kids from primary to high school can be exposed to an introduction to robotics. And the question I'd have the three of you is, how far do you think STEM is in achieving that?
Right, so, and I'll talk about this from my personal experience. So I grew up here in Kenya, had the privilege to go to some of the best schools in Kenya. And in that experience, what was taught was the combination between what you learn in books and trying to put that in application in experiments and learning by hand, right? And what I thought we were doing that a lot of wasn't even, maybe 10% when I realized when I went to university in the United States. Practical experiments and proving what you're doing was what helped me learn, right? And then also getting the experience of going through internships as in university and putting those skills into practice and learning was very beneficial to my career. So what I would like to say to the young engineers here is that education in books has to be partnered with learning and building, because that's where the lessons come, the learnings of making a mistake, understanding what you did wrong, and learning from that. So when we're doing STEM education, this is something that we do at Gearbox with Gearbox Academy, is trying to apply hands-on learning, practical learning, to validate what you've learned in the books, and then also take valuable lessons from there.
My name is Maluki. I'm the head of engineering of Gearbox. And my question is really about, the role of markets when it comes to, defining, opportunities, particularly here in Africa. To what degree do you think we can start thinking of ourselves as Africans, as one consolidated market?
We still get a lot of our material, like if you build a house, especially outside of the structural components, when you talk about interior components, majority of the components are still imported into the country. And I think the thing that we need to accept is, and it's happening, right? Like, I'll acknowledge that it's already happening. It's like, if you zoom out, you're seeing this happening in Rwanda, right? You zoom out and you look at what are the strengths that you have. And as soon as you acknowledge you don't have the scale and a demand, then you start looking for other ways for you to be competitive, right? And the thing that we have to accept as a region is just, even though we have 50 million, I don't know, about 50 million people, it's just still not yet enough, especially given where our GDP is. And so if you say, take cars, I'm going back to cars because that's what I understand, but you can use the same example in construction. If you take the percentage of people who can afford to spend a certain amount of money, it's still a small percentage of the 50 million, right? So I think, going back to your question, I think obviously consolidation of the market creates more incentive. And then just targeted policy where you say you want to localize some of the, the components. And then the other thing is, you should also force partnerships. The best way to grow companies in Kenya is say that you're going to force partnerships. So if a company is coming from China, is coming from Europe, they want to invest in the region, they have to partner with a local firm, because then that will help them in terms of upscaling them.
Good afternoon. My name is Natasha. I am a mechatronic engineering graduate.
Awesome.
You've told us a lot about your experience in the development of manufacturing processes. You also told us that your degree is kind of a hybrid between civil engineering and mechanical engineering. I'd like to know if any of the skills and experience you gained in the manufacturing industry were transferable when you decided to venture into the construction industry.
100%. Yeah, they're super. In fact, I don't think if I'd done automotive manufacturing, I would have been useful in construction, because the goal was to rethink construction, right? And so the construction industry hasn't changed in the last 80 years or 100 years. So the way your house is built today, it's the same way your house was built 100 years, right? Like very little change. Maybe there's a bit of technology that goes inside the house, but the process of construction hasn't changed. And so we didn't talk about this, but one of the reasons I love my time at City Storage Systems there, one of the mandates or the goals of the company was they were doing repurposing real estate, right? And so the premise was retail is transitioning from brick and mortar to online, which, by the way, this is before COVID. Today it's obvious, right? But a lot of retail is transitioning to online. And so the question is, what would happen to those, the physical assets that were built for brick and mortar retail?
Just like Dr. Kamal said, Raspberry Pi, we build sort of miniature computers that kind of helps this sort of hardware community to be able to build stuff, try stuff, and more recently we're finding a lot of Raspberry Pi products being used in industry. So it's going away from kind of the maker, hobbyist environment, and it's now started to be used in sort of industrial settings. And the reason why Raspberry Pi has sort of put a focus in Africa is a number of the things that we're doing here obviously needs to be supported by sort of key electrical components and products. And people will generally, especially in Africa, tend to get these products from elsewhere, whether it's in China or the US or the UK. By the time it gets here, it gets really expensive. And so that becomes even a problem that then limits engineers and makers to want to try stuff. And so the idea is, let's build out the channel here in Africa, get more resellers, get the products to be affordable, available, so that people can get them when they need them. So that's the whole idea of sort of Raspberry Pi increasing its footprints in Africa. But just going back to a lot of the conversations that I've been hearing today, I think one thing just stands out to me, and that's one big thing that, the reason why I even came back to Africa about 10 years ago is the only way that we could solve Africa's problems is we need to start thinking about homegrown solutions to our problems. We need to be the ones that take charge and say, we have to solve our problems. And in solving our problems, one of the things I'm starting to notice across Africa is in trying to solve our problems, we actually create wealth for ourselves. We create opportunities, for jobs. And when you think about the whole developer thing, the whole software thing that's going on, you think about, say, Andela, for instance, the number of engineers that they kind of threw out across Africa. And what that has meant is you see a huge number of startups. This is not being a coincidence that you're starting to see a lot of startups and investment coming into them. And when you think about these startups, what makes them successful? They're actually trying to solve local problems. And in trying to solve local problems, they're creating big businesses and supporting people and families. So I think that's the message, is that everything that we're doing, we need to keep thinking about the big picture of Africa. There are problems all around us. Let's start to think about how we solve those problems and start to think about the opportunity that solving those problems create for us, for the next generation, creating wealth.
Thank you very much.